The room didn't care who he was. It was Memphis, 1955. Hot, loud, packed with people who came to hear one voice, the undefeated local champion. He had never lost, not once. Every challenger before him had walked off that stage smaller than when they stepped on it. Then a name no one recognized was called. A young man stepped forward. Nervous? Maybe. Unknown? Definitely. No record deal, no fame, no reason for anyone to pay attention. Some people laughed. Others didn't even look up. Because to them, this wasn't a contest. It was a formality. The champion smirked, confident, already expecting another easy win. But the moment the young man took the microphone, something shifted. Not loud, not obvious. Just enough to make a few heads turn. This wasn't just another Tuesday night in Memphis. The talent shows of this era were proving grounds for raw potential, where unknowns could suddenly capture the attention of industry scouts. The crowd sensed it too, that electric feeling when something unexpected is about to happen. Whispers began to spread through the audience as the young man's composure shifted. The champion's smirk faded just slightly. Everyone in that room was about to witness a moment that would echo through decades. Because the voice that was about to come out of him wasn't ordinary. And the man they were about to dismiss would soon be known as Elvis Presley. Stay with me until the end. Because what happened when he started singing didn't just challenge a champion. It changed the future of music forever. Memphis in 1955 was a city that ran on music the way other cities ran on industry. You felt it before you heard it. The humidity pressed down on everything, and underneath that heat, sound was always moving. Out of open doorways, off the sidewalks, through the walls of buildings that had no business sounding the way they did. Beale Street was the center of it. The clubs there ran all week, not just weekends, and on any given night, you could hear something that would stay with you for the rest of your life. Gospel bled into blues. Blues bent towards something that didn't have a name yet. The musicians who played those rooms weren't doing it for history. They were doing it because it was what they knew, and because the city demanded it. Scattered across Memphis and the surrounding area were smaller rooms, halls, community centers, the back sections of restaurants, where amateur singing contests drew the kind of crowd that took this seriously. Not as entertainment, as a proving ground. The audiences were working people, factory workers, mechanics, waitresses coming off a double shift. They paid to get in, they brought opinions, and they were not patient with mediocrity. When someone wasn't good, the room let them know. When someone was genuinely good, the room let them know that too. And that response was the whole point. Winning one of those contests meant something real. Club owners attended. Local radio men showed up occasionally, looking for someone worth playing on air. Promoters moved through those rooms the way scouts move through minor league ballparks, watching for the thing that can't quite be taught. If you could walk into one of those venues as a nobody and walk out with the room still talking about you, doors opened. Maybe not immediately, maybe not all at once, but they opened. For a young singer with no connections and no label behind him, that was one of the only paths that existed. Elvis had taken his first steps down that path the year before. The summer of 1954, a session at Sun Studio with producer Sam Phillips had produced something unusual. A recording of That's All Right that didn't fit any category Memphis radio was built around, and yet Dewey Phillips had played it anyway, and the phones rang for an hour straight. That was real. That was something. But one song on local radio is not a career. It's a beginning if you're lucky, and a curiosity if you're not. Elvis was playing small shows throughout the region, places where the stage was barely raised off the floor and the audience was close enough to touch. He was figuring out what he was. He hadn't figured it out yet. Elvis Presley was 20 years old, had one regional radio hit to his name, and was still considered, by almost everyone who mattered, an interesting local curiosity. The man Elvis was about to face hadn't lost one of these contests in years. Not one. His name moved through the room differently than other names did. When people said it, conversation slowed. Heads turned. There was a kind of shorthand recognition that comes only from a proven record, and this man had built his the hard way, one contest at a time, over years of showing up and winning. He was a few years older than Elvis. Experience in the way that matters on a small stage, not schooled, but seasoned. He knew how to read a room before he sang a note. He could feel where the energy was sitting and move toward it. His voice was strong and controlled, rooted in the gospel tradition that ran deep through Memphis, shaped by the same church sounds that had come up from Mississippi and settled into the city's bones. When he sang, he didn't reach. He didn't strain. The sound came out of him like it had always been there, waiting. He'd won contests at the Eagle's Nest. He'd won at smaller halls over on the south side. He'd stepped onto stages where seasoned singers had tried to knock him down, and he'd walked off still standing every time. The people who ran these events knew his name. Club owners knew his name. The regular crowd knew exactly what they were getting when he was on the bill. Other singers had tried. Men with real ability, men who could hold a note and work a crowd. They came in with confidence and left quieter than they arrived. It wasn't that he was cruel about it. He didn't have to be. He was simply better than the situation required, and the audience understood that. They'd seen it enough times to stop being surprised. That night, the venue was packed in the way Memphis music halls got packed in summer. Wall to wall, the air thick and close, the smell of cigarettes and hair oil, and something sweet underneath it all. The wooden floor vibrated with the low noise of 100 conversations happening at once. People were dressed up just enough. Working people who'd come out after a long week, not to witness history, but to have a good time and hear somebody sing. The stakes, to most of them, were social. They wanted to be there when the familiar thing happened again. And the familiar thing was him winning. There was a particular ease in that room when his name was known to be on the card. The outcome felt settled before it started. Challengers would come and go. They always did. Some had talent. Most had nerve. But talent and nerve by themselves hadn't been enough in this room for a long time. You needed something beyond nerve. Something that couldn't be faked in front of a crowd that had already seen through every version of it. Most people in that building that night assumed the young unknown who had signed up to compete was carrying the one thing challengers always carried walking into a room like this. Not confidence, ignorance. Confidence, at least, knows what it's up against. When his name was called that night, The applause was the kind that comes from familiarity, people clapping for the outcome they already expected. When they called his name, a few people glanced up and then looked away again. That was the whole of it. No stir, no murmur of curiosity, just a name landing in a noisy room and dissolving before it reached the back wall. The man at the front who announced him had moved on before the syllables were finished, already thinking about the next order of business. That was what it meant to be unknown in a room like that. You were a gap between things that actually mattered. Elvis was 20 years old. He was lean, dark-haired, dressed in a way that's trying a little too hard and not quite landing. He had the look of someone who had spent time in front of a mirror but wasn't sure yet what he was supposed to be seeing. When he stood up and started moving toward the front, a few people near him tracked him briefly, the way you track any movement in a crowded space. Then they went back to their drinks, their conversations, their private concerns. He wasn't worth the interruption. Someone laughed, not at him directly, not loud enough to be cruel, just that low private laugh shared between two people who've already made up their minds. You could feel it in clusters around the room. The polite patience of an audience that was waiting for a formality to conclude. They had come for the champion. They knew how this ended. The only real question was how long the new name would hold the microphone before it was over. The champion was watching from the side. His expression hadn't changed. Why would it? He had been through this before. Some nervous kid would step up, give it his best, fall short of what the room required. It wasn't personal. It was just the order of things. Elvis reached the front. He didn't rush. That was the first thing, though almost nobody registered it. He moved at his own pace, not the eager scramble of someone trying to prove something before anyone could stop them, but not slow either, just his own pace. He took the microphone from the stand, adjusted it slightly, stood there for a half second that felt longer than it was. The room continued being the room. Conversations going, ice moving in glasses, the low, warm roar of people who weren't paying attention. Something was happening inside him that the room couldn't see. Not confidence exactly, not the clean, untroubled certainty of someone who knows the outcome in advance. It was something harder to name than that. A knowledge of what he was carrying, even without proof that anyone else could feel it. He had heard himself sing. He knew what happened when he stopped thinking about it and just let it come. Whether that mattered in a room like this, he couldn't say. But it was there. He knew it was there. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at a room full of people who had already decided he wasn't worth watching, and began to sing. For the first few seconds, the room didn't change. People kept talking. A glass clinked somewhere near the back. Someone laughed at something that had nothing to do with the stage. The indifference was total. The kind that only exists when an audience has already made up its mind. A few eyes drifted toward the young man at the microphone, registered nothing of interest, and drifted away again. This was the usual rhythm when an unknown stepped up. Polite patience. A room waiting for the formality to finish. Then something happened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a single phrase. The first real line of the song landing in a way that was just slightly wrong. Wrong in the sense that it didn't fit the category the audience had already filed it under. The voice was too raw for what they expected, too loose, too alive. It didn't sit where a voice was supposed to sit. It moved in the line instead of riding on top of it, bending notes that most singers would have left straight, finding the emotional center of a word and pressing on it like a bruise. One person stopped mid-sentence, then another. The laughter near the front went quiet first, then the side conversations. Not all at once, it happened in stages, the way silence spreads through a room when something real is occurring. Heads turned, not dramatically, just the slow, involuntary pivot of attention that a body does when something registers as important before the brain has caught up. Elvis wasn't doing what the champion did. He wasn't doing what any of them had heard before in a room like this. There was gospel in the way he held certain notes, the full-body commitment of someone who had grown up singing hymns like they meant something, like the words cost something to say. But underneath that was something else entirely, something that belonged to Beale Street, to the blues he had absorbed block by block growing up, music that carried the weight of real feeling without asking permission to. He had taken both of those things and done something with them that produced a sound that didn't belong to either world cleanly. It lived in the space between. And that space, it turned out, was electric. His body moved the way his voice moved, not a performance of movement, not the practiced showmanship of a man who had worked out his gestures in a mirror. Just genuine physical response to the music, a slight roll of the shoulder, the way his legs found the rhythm without appearing to try. It was unself-conscious, and an audience can feel the difference between someone performing emotion and someone actually having it. By the middle of the song, the room had made a shift that nobody had announced. The people at the bar were watching the stage. A woman near the right wall had put her drink down without noticing she'd done it. A group of men who had been fully absorbed in their own conversation were now quiet, looking forward. The noise that had been a constant presence since the room filled, that low, ambient roar of a crowd living its own life, had dropped to almost nothing. And the champion was watching too. His expression hadn't broken. He was too experienced for that. But something was registering behind it. A careful attention, the look of a man recalibrating. He had stood in that room many times and watched challengers come up short. He knew what that looked like. This was not that. He wasn't panicked, but he was paying attention in a way he hadn't expected to. Something in what he was hearing required it. The young man at the microphone didn't know what the room had done. He was too inside the song. He was singing the way he had always sung when he forgot to be nervous, totally, without holding anything back, giving the line everything it called for, and then a little more. The audience had come expecting nothing. They were now receiving something they didn't have a name for. It wasn't blues. It wasn't gospel. It wasn't country. It was all of those things filtered through one 20-year-old who hadn't yet learned to be careful with it. Whatever it was, and nobody in that room had a word for it yet, it was impossible to ignore. The champion stepped up after Elvis finished, and he sang well. He always sang well. His voice was controlled and practiced, shaped by years of working these same rooms, reading these same crowds. He hit his notes cleanly. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had stood in this exact spot before and walked away with the prize. Nothing had broken down in him. Nothing had failed. By any reasonable measure, he gave a strong performance, but a room was listening differently now. That's the thing nobody tells you about hearing something genuinely new. It recalibrates you. Your ears shift. What felt like the ceiling before starts to feel like the floor. The champion was singing the same way he always sang, but the audience was no longer measuring against the same standard they'd carried in with them 2 hours earlier. And he could feel it. Not in any obvious way. The applause was still there, still warm, still respectful, but there was a texture missing from it, the automatic certainty. The crowd wasn't leaning forward the way they had for the kid nobody had heard of. He sang his full set without stumbling. He finished strong. And when it was over, people clapped because he had earned that. But some of those same people were already turning to the person next to them and asking a question they hadn't asked about any previous challenger. Did you know who that other guy was? The judging took longer than usual. That alone said something. These contests typically didn't require much deliberation because the gap between the champion and everyone else had always been wide enough to settle quickly. This time, the judges conferred. There were voices raised, low but audible. People near the front craned their necks trying to read the conversation. The crowd stayed in their seats rather than drifting toward the door, which is what crowds do when the outcome feels inevitable. The champion won that night. He had more experience, more command, more history in that room, and in close contest, those things still carry weight. But the margin, whatever it was, felt like a different kind of result than any he had registered before. Winning by surviving a real challenge is not the same as winning the way he was accustomed to winning. Something had been asked of him that night that had never been asked before, and the room knew it, and he knew it. Afterward, the noise in the venue had a different quality. Small groups gathered near the back, near the bar, along the walls, and the conversation kept circling back to the same place. That kid with the dark hair, the one who moved like that. Where did he come from? Who is he? There was no good answer yet. He was a name without much attached to it, a voice that had done something in that room that people were still trying to put language around. The champion had won. His record was intact. But by the time the night ended, the name people kept repeating wasn't the champion's. That night was one of dozens like it across 1954 and 1955. Small rooms, real stakes, a young singer finding out what he was capable of. Memphis gave Elvis a laboratory that no record label could have designed. You don't learn to command a room by rehearsing in private. You learn it by walking into a crowd that doesn't know your name and making them feel something before you've finished your first verse. That was what these contests did. They were honest. The audience wasn't rooting for you. They were waiting to be moved, and if you couldn't move them, they went back to their drinks and their conversations and forgot you existed. Elvis was in those rooms repeatedly across those 2 years, and each time he walked out, he carried something new. Not technique, exactly. Something harder to name. He was learning where his voice could push and where it would break. He was learning what a crowd sounds like when it shifts. That change in the air when people stop pretending to pay attention and actually pay attention. You can't fake knowing that feeling. You have to earn it the hard way in front of real people who owe you nothing. The champion's dominance had done something quietly important to the local circuit. It had raised the floor. Singers who competed regularly in those Memphis venues knew they were being measured against someone serious. That pressure produced better performers across the board. It's not unlike what happens in any athletic circuit where one person keeps winning. Everyone around them gets sharper. The standard gets set, and you either find a way to meet it or you don't come back. Elvis came back. More than that, he came back different each time. Facing someone undefeated forced a clarity that easier contests couldn't. When you know the person across from you has never lost, you don't hold anything in reserve. You bring everything you have, including the parts of yourself you're still figuring out. That's what competition does when it's real. It's not a threat. It's a forcing function. It pushes you past what felt like your limit and shows you there was more on the other side. Within a year of these small venue battles, the rooms were getting larger. By late 1955, radio was paying attention beyond Memphis. The regional buzz that had started with "That's All Right" on local stations was beginning to travel. Club owners in Arkansas and Mississippi and Tennessee were requesting him. The machinery of something much larger was beginning to assemble, though nobody could see the full shape of it yet. The Ed Sullivan appearances were less than 2 years away. The screaming crowds, the national television cameras, the sound that would define a generation, all of it was downstream from nights like this one. Nights in warm, cramped venues where a 20-year-old learned that his voice could do something he didn't fully understand. The people who were in those rooms in 1954 and 1955 mostly didn't know what they were watching. Why would they? He was just another young singer trying to win a local contest. But memory does something interesting to ordinary nights once they stop being ordinary. What felt unremarkable at the time becomes a story you tell your children, then your grandchildren. You remember where you were standing. You remember the moment the noise dropped. You remember thinking something was different, even if you couldn't say what. The people who were there would spend years trying to describe exactly what it felt like before they knew who he was going to become. The thing that separated Elvis from every other singer in those rooms wasn't just the voice. It was where the voice had come from. Memphis in 1955 had no shortage of talented singers. That has to be said clearly, because it matters. There were men on that circuit who could hold a note, work a crowd, move a room. The champion himself was proof of that. Talent alone was not rare. What was rare, what nobody had quite seen yet, was the specific combination of everything that had made Elvis Presley who he was by the time he walked into those rooms. He wasn't performing from a tradition. He was performing from a life. He grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi. Poor enough that poverty wasn't a condition. It was just the air. The family attended the First Assembly of God Church, where worship wasn't formal or restrained. It was full body, full voice, full surrender. That was the first music he absorbed, not as a student, as a child. It went in deep, below the level of technique, below anything you could consciously choose to imitate or set aside. Gospel wasn't something Elvis had learned, it was something he had become. And then there was the radio. Growing up, he tuned into black stations, listening to blues singers whose emotional range went places that polite white country music refused to go. He heard Beale Street before he ever walked it. By the time he was old enough to make the trip to Memphis, that sound had already been living inside him for years. He wasn't borrowing it. He wasn't approximating it. He had spent so long listening that the feeling behind it had become his own. What came out of him on stage then wasn't a style. It was a collision. Gospel urgency pressed up against blues feeling pressed up against the country music he'd heard all his life. And none of it stayed separate. Most singers, even very good ones, lived inside a category. They knew what they were. That clarity was a kind of safety. It told audiences what to expect. It told the singer how to behave. Elvis didn't have that. He hadn't figured out how to edit himself into something recognizable yet, and in 1955, he still hadn't learned to want to. That made some people uneasy. You could see it in certain rooms. The slight confusion when he moved in ways that didn't match the music they thought they were hearing. The uncertainty about whether to respond to the gospel in his phrasing or the blues in his rhythm. He didn't fit any of the boxes people used to sort performers. For some audiences, that was genuinely uncomfortable. The brain wants to categorize. When it can't, the instinct is sometimes suspicion. But for others, that same quality was the thing that made them stop talking and look up at the stage. Something unclassifiable, when it's real, carries a charge that something familiar never quite reaches. You don't know why it moves you. You just know that it does. The champion that night had been built by the existing tradition. He was shaped by what had worked before him, refined by what audiences had already rewarded. That made him excellent. Elvis had been built by something that didn't have a name yet. He didn't sound like the blues, and he didn't sound like country, and he didn't sound like gospel, and somehow he sounded like all three at once. And that was exactly the problem, and exactly the point. By the summer of 1955, the rooms were getting bigger and the crowds were getting louder. And people who had been ignoring Elvis Presley were starting to pay attention whether they wanted to or not. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a fire catches, slowly, then everywhere. Club owners in Memphis had started talking to each other. A promoter books this kid. The crowd stays late. They don't just applaud, they react. There's a difference, and the men who ran those venues understood it immediately. You can teach an audience to clap. You cannot teach them to lose their minds. Elvis was doing something to rooms that owners couldn't explain but absolutely wanted to sell tickets to again. Colonel Tom Parker had heard the name. Parker was not a man who moved quickly toward anything he wasn't certain about, but by mid-1955 he was watching. He had managed country acts for years, understood how the Southern touring circuit worked, knew which performers had a ceiling and which ones didn't. What he saw in Elvis was something he hadn't seen before, a young man who generated a physical reaction in a crowd, not admiration, something closer to disruption. Parker recognized that this was rare enough to pursue carefully. The summer shows were telling. One night in Jacksonville, Florida, in August of 1955, Elvis performed on a bill with several other acts. The crowd was several thousand people. When he finished, girls rushed the stage. Not a few, dozens. Security was overwhelmed. Elvis lost his shoes. His jacket was torn. He stood backstage afterward, looking shaken and amazed in equal measure. Scotty Moore, who'd been playing guitar beside him since those first Sun sessions, said later he'd never seen anything like it, and nobody had, because it hadn't happened before. That reaction wasn't random. It was the product of every small room Elvis had performed in over the previous year. Every contest, every half-empty roadhouse, every skeptical crowd he had to win from scratch. He had learned, through repetition, how to build a moment, how to hold back and then release, how to make silence work as hard as sound. Those skills don't arrive fully formed. They get built night after night in front of people who don't care who you are yet. The champion Elvis had faced months earlier was part of that education. So was every other room that made him earn it. Radio was catching up. DJs across the Mid-South were getting requests they hadn't anticipated. Teenagers were calling in asking for the kid from Memphis. Sam Phillips at Sun Records had known something was there from the beginning, but even he was watching the momentum build with a kind of quiet astonishment. What had started as a regional curiosity was becoming a regional force. And regional forces, if they're real, don't stay regional. RCA Records was already in conversation with Parker by the fall. The label understood what they were looking at. So did Parker. So, quietly, did Elvis. By November of that year, he had signed with RCA Records, and the local circuit that had tested him and shaped him was about to feel very small. The champion went on competing after that night, as he had before. And he was still talented, still capable, still the kind of singer that small rooms respected. Nothing about him had changed. His voice was the same. His instincts were the same. The crowds who loved him before still loved him. But something had entered the circuit that hadn't been there before. And that changes things whether you want it to or not. Being undefeated is a different thing from being permanent. He had mastered a world. The problem was that the world wasn't finished moving. What he could not have known, standing on that stage in Memphis in 1955, was that the ground shifting beneath him wasn't personal. It was historical. Nobody outworks that. Nobody out-talents it. You simply either happen to be the new thing or you happen to be standing next to it. And there is something worth honoring in that. He was good enough to matter. Good enough that facing him meant something. The pressure those contests produced, the real, earned, unforgiving pressure of a room that had already made up its mind, that pressure is what forced Elvis to reach. Not a label, not a manager, not a television camera. A man in a small venue who had never lost and was not going to make it easy. Elvis found out what his voice could do to people in rooms exactly like that one. He found out that it wasn't a trick, wasn't luck, was something real. And that knowledge carried forward through every bigger stage and every larger crowd was built on a foundation that the champion helped lay without ever intending to. He had spent years being unbeatable, and in doing so, without ever meaning to, he had given Elvis Presley exactly the kind of opponent a future king needs someone worth beating.